Hi, you've reached the Talking Racewalking podcast. It's all about racewalking, of course. It's talking to racewalkers from around the world about racewalking. Join me, Noel Payne, a amateur racewalker in Canada, as I talk to elites, Olympians, record holders, masters walkers, and anybody who's out walking as fast as they can. Hi, so this is a section where I'd actually be talking to someone, a race walker. So this is where you can come in. If you know a race walker, you're a race walker, and you have an amazing story, I want to hear from you. So reach out, let's chat, let's get walking and talking. Hey everyone, yet again, another episode of Talking Racewalking. The podcast is going. I'm finding more people to talk to, and I've got a treat for you this time. I've got Matthew Algeo, who is an author, not a race walker. So why did I invite him? Because he wrote a book called Pedestrianism. So I guess we should probably tell you what that is as well, but we'll get into that. But just know that race walking was not always called race walking. And back in the day, way back, we'll explain when, it was called pedestrianism. So I want to welcome Matthew. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Noel. It's good to be here.
Yes, we've, for those folks listening, Matthew and I have sort of connected here and there. I read his book. I thought it was amazing. And then I wrote my own book on race walking, and I pinned him down and squeezed a quote out of him for it. So, which was very, very nice of him. So just so your eyes don't glaze over or your ears, we'll get into it right away. I brought Matthew on because race walking has a very interesting history if you don't know what it is. It basically, I'll start it off and I'll let Matthew kind of go into things as well, but he wrote a book about basically competitive walking. So mid 1800s-ish, walking was actually more popular than anything going around at the time. Organized baseball hadn't started. People had more money in their pockets. And competitive walking, where people would put money down on the winner, or, they were putting lots of money down. People were getting paid to walk. And this is kind of what led, many years later to what we now call race walking. So, Matthew, this is a niche sport. Why did you decide to write a book about competitive walking?
Well, it actually goes back to the first book I wrote, which was about the 1943 merger of two National Football League teams, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Philadelphia Eagles. So during World War II in 1943, they had to merge for a year. They became the Steagles. The players were all deferred from the draft. So you had guys with ulcers or perforated eardrums, that sort of thing. So, I have a niche for very, very obscure sports history. But while I was researching the Steagles book, I went and looked at the history of professional sports and spectator sports in the United States. And much to my amazement, I found that in those decades after the Civil War, in the US from like mid 1860s, really up until the 1880s, 1890s, competitive long distance race walking was the most popular spectator sport in the United States. And this was at a time there was a lot of industrial development in the United States, urbanization, people are moving to the cities. At the same time, we're building the first big public structures where you could have mass events like this, the first Madison Square Garden in New York, for instance. So you had people working in factories around the clock, had a little extra money, maybe a dime, and they would hold these 6-day race walking events that would run continuously, 24 hours, from just after midnight on Monday morning until just before midnight Saturday night. and thousands of people would fill arenas. This would be all in the newspapers. People would wager huge sums of money on it. It was the development of corporate sponsorship. Newspapers would pay competitors to have their logo on their shirt, that sort of thing. And so back when I was researching the football book, this stuck in my head. And a few years later, I was able to take time to really take a deep dive into it, and that's how I ended up writing the book.
Well, it's amazing, and I'm glad you did. I mean, when I started looking into the sport, I really stumbled across your book. And for anybody out there, just go to Amazon or wherever you want, type in Matthew's name and pedestrianism. It should come up. It's an amazing, like it's a lot of details, but it's a good read. I really enjoyed reading it. Um, and it really brings, if people thought race walking was an odd sport now, where, people are race walking for 50K, their minds are literally going to explode when they read this, because race walking is actually fairly mundane and fairly short compared to how it started. I mean, you mentioned the 6-day races. I think at the start of your book there, you talk about too, kind of the spark of the sport, where there were a couple walkers who decided to almost basically race across the United States, I think, which kind of
Yeah, so
almost kicked it off.
a lot of it goes back to gambling.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so there would be these wagers people would have, and you go back really very early in the 1800s, I believe it was. Captain Barclay, who was a British uh, aristocrat,
yeah.
he wagered that for 1,000 guineas that he could walk 1 mile every hour for 1,000 hours. That's about 41 days.
Oh,
And he did it. It became a huge event. Again, one of the first major public sporting events in the Western world. People would come from miles around to watch Captain Barclay walk half a mile up the road and half a mile back. He came up with kind of a clever way to do it. He would walk 1 mile right before, leave at 10 minutes before the hour. Not that, probably not even that soon, maybe 15 minutes. He would walk the mile, then it would become the hour, and then he would walk another mile. And that gave him essentially 2 hours of rest between miles, but still just an amazing feat. And then this sort of got transplanted to the US really in the 1860s. Edward Payson Weston is kind of the father of the sport in the US. And he began his career on a wager. He wagered a friend that he could walk from Boston to Washington. I think it was in 10 days to see Lincoln's inauguration
that's
in
right. Yeah.
1861. And he ended up being, I forget, just a few hours late. So
So that's not bad.
he didn't quite make it. He got lost. The had a problem with the GPS somewhere in Philadelphia. So he did he got off track, so he didn't quite make it. But just the spectacle again of this man. And the other thing to keep in mind at the time, it like wasn't easy to walk. There weren't paved roads. It was mud. It was the middle of winter, snow, frozen, rutted roads. And of course, there's no motels to speak of. There's no hospitality industry to speak of. So these were people who were undertaking really, really grueling events. And if you think it sounds grueling now, to walk from Boston to Washington in 10 days, it was a lot harder in 1861. So after the war, Weston then began. He'd become kind of a celebrity and started putting on these walking exhibitions. He'd travel around the country and walk 100 miles in 24 hours, and he'd charge people 10 cents to come see him. That'd be inside maybe a skating rink. Roller skating was popular at the time. And so people did. And then naturally, when people saw the popularity of this and how Weston was making a living at it, other people came in. Daniel O'Leary was the most famous. And
That's
that sort
right.
of,
Yes.
yeah, that was the birth of then, okay, we have to have, Weston versus O'Leary for the pedestrian champion of America. And they went to Chicago and they did a 6-day race and so it sort of just grew organically. I mean, it filled a niche, it filled a void. There were all these people in the city, like I said. There was nothing to do. I mean, there's no electricity in most apartments where people lived, right? You were limited by candlelight. There's no phonograph. Of course, there's no record, no radio or TV. So there are so few opportunities for entertainment, especially for the working people. You know,
It's it's
the
interesting
fancy,
too. I think if I
fancy,
was going to say, I just wanted to jump in while I had the thought too. I think if I remember correctly, I think they had some of the first like really. I know that World Wrestling Federation or whatever it's called now, they had the big belts. If I remember correctly,
right,
the Walkers got like those big
right,
wrestling gold belts at the time, so they were the first
right.
ones to have those as well.
So there was a guy in Britain actually, and then so the Brits took it up too. Rowe was the guy's name. I think it was Charles Rowe, but he was the most famous pedestrian in Britain, and he challenged the American, and then of course the British
Was it
had
the
had a
world?
had,
Yeah.
had a belt roll, yeah, had a belt, the Astley belt, and Astley was the guy that did it. And yeah, so you had this big belt. You were just like just like WWF, and it was like the winner kept the belt, and it was all very kind of dramatic and a little bit like wrestling. The competitors had personalities. Yeah, you knew, and like Weston always dressed. He was a dandy, and he wore a long black coat and a roughly frilly shirt and carried the cane and a hat, and then O'Leary was sort of the taciturn Irish immigrant who just like carried a corn cob in each hand and it moved like pistons. And I talk about how kids would, go watch these guys and they would imitate the way they walked, the way that, a kid might imitate, I don't know, the way a baseball player, his stance at the plate or something. So that's how ingrained it really became. And it really just exploded. And it was just sort of this confluence of events that made it happen. The urbanization and the industrialization and the economy was good and immigrants were pouring in. And so it was really sort of a very much of its time.
Yeah, I found that very, very interesting. I haven't looked to see if it's at first, but I know people talk about the first baseball trading cards. Um, I don't know. I know hockey's been going for a long time. I didn't know when hockey cards came out, but I think if it's not in your book, it's I've seen it, but I think it's in your book where they had walking like
Yep.
walker cards, like
Yep.
actually like sports cards now they had for walkers.
Yeah.
That I found
They
amazing.
were one of the earliest trading cards, featured pedestrians that were ironically featured in cigarette packs. But that goes to the other thing where the training methods were
A little
were
different.
pretty primitive, and a lot of them did smoke, and a lot of them swore by consuming large amounts of champagne. That was their secret. And I like that. What was one of the guys was greasy eel broth, which
That sounds yeah, that sounds like it's
yeah,
performance enhancing.
big bowls of greasy eel. But they did have, Weston got in trouble because he was chewing coca leaves
But that
uh,
might have some effect, yeah.
during a race, and so we even had early doping scandals in the early days of pedestrianism and race walking with the 6 day races. So it's so fun to go back to a totally different era, but then you see so much, reflected in our current era. So
Oh,
that's pretty cool.
completely. Yeah, you definitely can. And anybody listening too, I mean, I've read quite a bit about this. I've read other books other than Matthew's as well and got online. There's lots of stuff. But what you find out is too, I mean, it is a lot of flash and pomp and betting, and it's like the WWF with the characters. But I don't think we should get away from the fact as well that these were impressive feats of
Oh my
of
gosh.
walking, like not just walk.
It's
They weren't just casually walking.
No,
That
these were guys who
oh
would do 500 or 600 miles in 6 days.
yeah, it's impressive even
Some
now.
even now. And you would probably know better than I. I forget what the record for a long time. I think it was 580 some miles. That was set in like 1889,
It
right?
stayed for a long time.
And it was a very famous Greek ultra.
Yanis, yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
he ended up breaking it, and that was like almost 100 years later.
yeah.
And there were people that thought it was impossible, that there was some problem with record keeping or measuring the distance, but it turned out that it was possible, but it took 100 years. Of course, there weren't a lot of people doing that in the intervening 100 years, but yeah,
Yeah.
do not forget that some of these guys were world-class athletes for their time. I mean, what they would do was amazing feats of, physical exertion and plus sleep deprivation. It was just incredible what they did.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's interesting too, you don't go to into the race walking portion of things, but when you look at it from a race walking perspective in terms of race walkers now, at the time these folks also weren't race walking. There was no straight leg, there was no the technique we see now. For the most part, until the very end, when runners started to sort of come into the thing and they had to start defining what was walking and running. In the
Mhm.
early days, it was all walking, and they were just walking as
Heel,
whatever way they
heel
could do it. It
toe.
was as fast as they could go.
Right. And they would have judges who would watch to make sure that there was always a piece, a part of their body, a part of their foot in contact with the ground at all times. And so it was walking. It was strictly walking. But
Yeah,
you're right. They didn't walk in the technique that I think people are accustomed to today. Although I think Weston did a little bit. People talk about how he moved
a
his
little bit of
hips a
hip
lot.
movement. Yeah,
Yeah, and I would love it's such a shame we don't have any motion pictures of any of these guys. It would be, well, just to see maybe 15 seconds of an 1880s race walking event would be so cool just to see the different styles that people had that they brought. I mean, they're really experimenting with the most effective ways to move their bodies. And there's really an interesting sort of sports medicine aspect to that they're they're kind of breaking new ground. They're setting the stage for all the great athletic events that come after.
yeah, completely. I think for the race walking world, I think at the time, it would probably wouldn't have been defined as race walking as we see it now. It could have even been more perhaps fallen into what we call power walking. But
Yeah.
either way, they were walking as quickly as they could do for hours upon hours, and just the feats themselves were so impressive. Um,
It was interesting reading about how uh, the different ways they approached it. Some people would sleep for like 4 hours overnight, and some people would sleep, I guess it's polyphasic sleep, where they would sleep 45 minutes or an hour every 3 or 4 hours for a week. And so they were
I
basically just
remember that.
taking power naps, every 3 or 4 hours to keep moving. So yeah, it was a lot of exertion.
It is a very interesting history that I don't think many people really know, and I think I know a lot of probably race walkers will listen to this, but I think runners and others would be very interested as well because this is really the precursor to um, the ultra community that
Yeah.
started not that long ago, really, where people are doing ultra events. And these guys
Hmm.
were basically doing the same thing, like they're covering a distance, trying to figure out when do you sleep, when do you eat, doing that type of thing, pushing their bodies to the extreme. The very first event is probably actually what's become popular in the last little while. They call them like backyard ultras, where they have to do cover like 5 kilometers or 5 miles every hour. It's the same type of thing
Right.
as that very first contest where he was like a mile an hour. It's the same
Right.
thing. It's part physical and part mental.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And the yes, and seeing how people coped with the psychological aspect of it is interesting too. I think I have a story in there about a guy who finally these guys would have managers, trainers
Yeah.
who were really just guys to keep
Took the
kicking them
money.
and make sure they stayed awake, right? They wouldn't
Yeah.
let them sleep. And so finally, one of the walkers was apparently delirious and grabbed the handgun and started shooting it. Nobody got hurt, but I think it really sent people over the edge psychologically, trying to push your body that hard, and some people just couldn't do it.
Yeah. No, it was a very interesting read, and I think it's amazing. Out of now, how has it been after you've written the book? Like you wrote because you found it. Have you found you've learned more about walking and race walking than you probably ever wanted to know now after writing the book
I
and doing these podcasts?
I have to say now, you said in the intro that I'm not a race walker, and I'm not.
Yep, yep.
But I want to say, after the book came out, a
Uh-oh, here we go,
guy,
folks. Here we go, folks. If we hooked them.
if no, well, a little bit, a guy, a young man named Greg Salvesen. Actually, he's become a good friend of mine, and he competes in some long distance races. And he said, "Well, you got to try one of these, you know." So he convinced me, and he sort of helped me get ready. I did a 24-hour race in northern New Jersey here at 3 Day at the Races, it's called, and I did 51 miles. They're all walking. And then I did another one just last year. I did 52 miles. So I think I've proved my point. I've done 103 miles lifetime at 3 days at the fair. So, but I have done it. So, and I really would not have um even thought about doing something like that. And the 24-hour races I love because really you'll have guys who are, I mean, there are guys that are doing 100 miles, right? And then they're just schmucks like me. I mean, staying out of their way. But it's really kind of a cool. I love it because every variety of every level of achievement is represented there, and you're all really on the same level. You're just going around on this 1 mile track at the fairgrounds. So it was really a cool experience. I'm glad I was cajoled into doing that. It wouldn't happen if I hadn't done the book. So it was
Well,
pretty cool.
it's no congratulations to that. It's no small feat. I've walked 50K, 80K, 100K, and whether you're doing it race walking or walking, I think it's very interesting because it's the amount of time on your feet. You think it's just walking, but after you've been doing that long enough, you realize how much effort and time and physical effort it does take.
The thing that impressed me most was I had pretty good shoes. I still ended up losing toenails, right? These guys, what were these guys wearing? I mean,
Not
they're
anything we
wearing
would
like,
call a shoe.
right. They're like basically in leather boots. I mean, the equipment they used. I mean, just to think about that, I can't imagine what their feet must have looked like after that. It's pretty impressive.
It
Yeah.
very much is. It reminds me of a book. I'm a kind of a runner, race walker. I've done both. And one of the books I wrote that you might be interested, actually, just a pure curiosity, because
Mhm.
you've written the book and you've done some, it's called the Bunyan Derby. I forget what the,
Oh, yeah.
yes. And it's these long distance runners who basically run across the states, kind of the same kind of circus about betting and money and
Hmm.
characters, but the same thing, you see them in the paces and the distance they're covering, and then you have to stop yourself and go, good Lord, they're doing this on dirt roads with mud, very poor food, rest, in leather shoes, like just
Ain't no
unreal.
RV
Yeah,
like following them. No.
no, they'd be lucky to like sleep on a tent on the ground for a few
Right.
hours. So
But
yeah.
that was a whole craze too. There was a good one. You should look up in Canada. It was two guys who pushed a barrel from pushed a barrel from I think it was New Brunswick to Vancouver.
Oh, I
Uh,
think I've heard of this.
yeah, so it was like in the teens or the 20s. There just seemed to be this rash of people who would just up and walk across the country kind of thing. It's just such a fascinating thing. I'm always curious about the psychology or the mental attitude of people who who take that up. There's got to be a little bit of crazy in there.
Yeah, there might be. I'm coughing here. Yeah,
Yeah, a little.
there could be. And it's funny how um I think people nowadays too think they've invented the ultra world, but I think if you go back and look, I think it's been so long ago that you've forgotten that, yeah, this isn't new.
Mhm.
Um, but it's quite interesting. What's your takeaway from this? Before I let you go,
Mhm.
um, what's the one takeaway from writing the book or learning about, I guess we'll call it pedestrianism because race walking evolved from this. Um,
Mhm.
what's your one takeaway from the book? The one little tidbit that you found just that always sticks with you?
That people walked so much more. That walking was the primary means of transportation. I have a statistic in there. I don't want to misquote it. It was something like the average woman in North Carolina walked 10 miles a day just getting water, you know,
Yeah.
and how walking was, and I think that was part of the appeal to it. This was something that everybody did all the time.
It's like you relate to it.
Yes. And you had to be very rich to have a horse, much less a carriage.
Yeah.
So people really related to it. And also, it opened the door for people who didn't have a lot of money, working class people, poor farm people.
They'd have a chance.
Right.
Yeah.
They're like, I could do that. I can walk 100 miles in 24 hours. I'm already walking 30 every 24 hours anyway. You know, I mean, people walked so much more. Walking was a part of people's lives in a way that it just isn't anymore. I mean, people, I see this stuff. I try to get a 10,000 steps in or whatever you're supposed to get in. And people 150 years ago would laugh. 10,000 steps.
They
That's
got
getting
that
out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I got that by noon. So that was definitely something that really stuck with me, how we've really kind of forgotten that walking was how people lived, you know? I mean,
Yeah,
you hear stories of people who, you know, never went farther than 20 miles from the place they were born. Well, the only way they could go more than 20 miles was to walk. So, you know, why
yeah,
would
limited.
you? Yeah.
Well, it limited you, but at the same time, it didn't limit you in terms of certain things. And I think people have forgotten how active. I mean, that's why gyms pop up now, and we had to force ourselves to do things to keep ourselves active. We've forgotten that walking, you know, kept us fit, and the more conveniences that came about made it easier for us and then harder for us in other ways too. So
yeah,
exactly.
That's true.
Matthew, this has been a lovely chat. It's been great. I wasn't going to mention it, but I will. People can't see us, but there are two, I say, handsome, balding, spectacled individuals chatting here over Zoom. We're having a ball.
We have got the nerdy demographic well covered.
There we go. It's been a pleasure. People,
Thank you, Noel.
if you haven't read or you don't even know what pedestrianism is, please type in pedestrianism, just like pedestrian with ISM at the end. There's kind of a subtitle to the rest of his book, but just type that into Amazon. You'll find Matthew's book. Go check it out. It's an amazing, fun read. And it basically is the start of what we now call race walking. So Matthew, thanks again for coming on. And
you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me, Noel. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You have a great time. Take care. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
That's it, folks. The end of the podcast. No walkers have been harmed in the recording of this podcast. And, of course, at the moment, we have no sponsors or supporters at this point to fund all this amazing podcasting. But if you're out there and have a race walk company that produces some sort of race walk apparel product or something you think race walkers would love, get hold of us. We'd love to have you on board. Give us a holler.